My name is Steve Weitzman, and I'm here in my capacity as director of the Patt Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. And I want to welcome you all to an hour-long Zoom program on the future of anti-Semitism research. These days, if you hear the words anti-Semitism and university in the same sentence, the chances are that you are reading a news story about university campuses as a center or hotbed of anti-Semitism, or more recently, you've been reading stories about how the federal government is now intervening in its effort to address anti-Semitism and exacting a great cost from universities as part of that process. We're not going to be talking directly about those. They may come up in the conversation and Q&A part of today's program, but our focus today is on a different relationship between universities and anti-Semitism, and that is the role of the university as a center for new research in anti-Semitism. Especially in the last 50 or so years, the university has really emerged as a major center for new research into anti-Semitism, into the study of the history of anti-Semitism, its impact on Jews in the past, but also the sociology of anti-Semitism, why anti-Semitism happens, what motivates it, how it expresses itself, and also the culture of anti-Semitism, how it expresses itself through art, music, literature, and other dimensions of human culture. Of course, there are other organizations that support research into anti-Semitism as well, ADL, organizations like that. But in most cases, even those other institutions are relying on scholars trained in a university setting. They're relying on data, on archives, on libraries that universities provide. So universities have really been a very important part of the effort to understand anti-Semitism, and that's what this program is about. The three scholars that we invited to participate in this are all outstanding scholars of anti-Semitism in their own right. However, they also share something in common, and that is that they're all directors of major centers of either anti-Semitism research or Jewish studies research. They played a very important role in the last 2 years as universities have tried to figure out how to adapt to this climate that we've been in. And in fact, over the last year or so, the four of us as directors of research centers have decided to join forces, to work together, to collaborate in order to be helpful to the field of anti-Semitism studies as it tries to navigate the challenging times that we're in. And last January, just a few months ago, we were able to cooperate and partner together on a major conference that brought about 40 scholars of anti-Semitism together to NYU. And that was really meant as an effort to launch a more sustained effort to promote new kinds of collaboration and new ways of working together. So I'm really grateful to all three of them for their collaborative spirit, for their partnership. And let me just take a moment to introduce each one individually now. The first person who will be speaking to us is Professor Anna Shternshis, who's director of the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto, and also the Richard and Dorothy Schiff Chair of Jewish Studies. Anna is an award-winning scholar of Yiddish and Soviet Jewish culture, whose projects include a Grammy-nominated album of lost Yiddish songs from the period of the Holocaust that she was able to retrieve and reconstruct and to perform. That's not the only reason we've invited her to be part of this conversation. She's also, as I mentioned, the director of a major center for Jewish studies in Canada, which has actually created something called the Lab for the Global Study of Anti-Semitism, which is at the forefront of this field. So after she goes, we'll be joined by Professor Avi Patt, who is the Maurice Greenberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at NYU and the inaugural director of the Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at NYU. Avi is a leading scholar of the Holocaust and Holocaust memory, publishing multiple books on the topic, and also creating many new educational resources for students, including a pop-up one-credit course at the University of Connecticut that reached over 1,600 students in the first time that it was offered. And as I mentioned, he's also the director of NYU Center for Anti-Semitism Studies and has been very generous and visionary in the collaboration that we've pulled together in the last year or so. And the last speaker will be Professor Jeffrey Veidlinger, who is the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of Michigan, the longtime director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, and now the director of the newly inaugurated Raoul Wallenberg Institute whose mission is to embody the values associated with Wallenberg by studying hatred against Jews and other religious and ethnic communities and to promote cross-cultural understanding. So we're delighted to have all three of these wonderful scholars with us. And we're going to turn now to Anna, who will begin with some reflections. So thank you.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be part of this conversation, great to be invited. The topic so-so, maybe next year we can do something more cheerful than studies of anti-Semitism. But I thought I would say a few words about why the turn of the field to anti-Semitism studies and offer some insights from the work that I'm doing on that. So those of us working in Jewish studies, those of us working at universities have thought a lot in the past 2 years, but even longer about hostile climate that emerged on campus for Jewish students, for Jewish faculty, for Jewish workers on campus. And people have different examples. Some of them have to do with actual hostility and violence that they experienced, others with uncomfortable encounters. But more or less, many Jews on campus, no matter what role they play, have a story to tell about what happened to them or what happened to their friend in the past 2 years. And many of those people did not have stories like that, even if they worked in Jewish studies in the past. It's interesting about anti-Semitism that, as my colleague David Hirsch from London said in a different context, anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic expressions almost always come as a shock. So in other words, even if we see things emerging and part of culture being receptive to anti-Semitic remarks or even discriminatory practices, when the people actually encounter that, it comes as a shock. Well, everything was fine until this happened. And thinking about the shock and thinking about the widespread nature of it in North America, somewhere where we did not expect to see so many expressions of hostility to Jews so soon, the area that calls for studying of that, it belongs to what social scientists call urgent research. In other words, we have to study things right now, we have to understand what's going on, and then maybe make some conclusions. Well, I come from, I am a cultural historian, literary scholar, so urgent research is the opposite of what I do. Instead, slow research, close reading of things is what helps with my methods. Nevertheless, one cannot help but wonder how to make sense of what we see now using maybe some things that we learned about the past. So my field is Soviet Jewish history, and specifically, I'm working on Soviet Jewish life under Stalin. For decades now that I've been addressing this field, the biggest challenge was, how do you explain that? How do you study that area of history and write about this so your North American readers understand what you're talking about? It seemed that everything about Jewish life in the Soviet Union was very different from Jewish life in Canada or Jewish life in the United States. Elie Wiesel's misunderstood and misinterpreted of an expression of Jews of silence is something that was referred to Soviet Jews. Well, American Jews or Canadian Jews are anything but Jews of silence. In fact, the idea of being proudly Jewish, the idea of building big Jewish community centers, large synagogues, very well supported Jewish studies programs. This is part of American Jewish life. And dealing with things that are happening on campus right now, that comes as a shock and direct opposition to what's going on. And one of the things that I thought about when I was finishing my book now on Jewish life under Stalin, I was writing this paragraph about which part of Soviet Jews experienced discrimination and hostility in the Soviet society more than others. And the answer to that is that actually the majority of Soviet Jews lived relatively fine after the war. They succeeded in their career paths and they succeeded in building their lives the way they wanted, with some exceptions. And those notable exceptions came from the fields of higher education, creative sectors. So, for example, journalists, writers' unions expelled Jews. A lot of Jewish photographers could not find a job, including a famous photographer, Evgeny Khaldei, who took a famous photograph of a Red Army soldier with a red flag on top of Berlin building, which became an iconic symbol of World War II and the Red Army victory. So he could not find job after 1948. Then in 1948, when Israel was created, the Soviet government led by Joseph Stalin supported that initiative. UN vote was crucial. Soviet UN vote was crucial in making that happen. But then Soviet Jews who supported that own initiative by their own government just a few years later were severely punished for it. Many of them who wrote or even spoke to their friends about how excited they are that the Jewish state is created, later were denounced by some of those friends or by others who heard them for supporting the wrong initiative. In other words, having more loyalty to this barely existing state of Israel than to the Soviet Union. So a lot of those things are reminding me of things that I'm witnessing today. The fight against anti-Semitism on campus, for example, in the name of protecting Jews with methods that provoke outrage and shock and I don't know, misunderstanding of why that should happen that way. So are signaling perhaps of some parallels of how if you're fighting against a phenomena in a way that will make other people outraged at the fight, who will then pay for those measures? In other words, are campuses difficult for Jewish people to navigate? Is anti-Semitism real? Absolutely. Is fighting against anti-Semitism by firing people, by cutting funding to universities, by expelling or deporting students or people who are engaged in those activities hostile to Jews, is this something that will help Jews or hurt Jews? My work as a Soviet Jewish historian shows that it will definitely hurt Jews. Even in the short term, it's not clear how much benefit Jewish faculty and students will get from those kind of measures. There's already conversation, and then maybe my colleagues will report on that. But even I heard about faculty and students complaining to Jewish faculty and students saying, "Why did you complain so much about anti-Semitism on campus? Look what's going on now. It's so much worse." So, and this is a short term. Long term, there is a big danger of Jewish people on campus paying a big price for those measures. Somebody will come and fix the injustice and things like this. So, I will maybe finish my remarks by saying that people often dismiss Soviet Jewish experience, saying, well, something like this can never happen here because it's such a different context. But unfortunately, so many things that we see happening here are very similar. They're not the same, and the context is not the same, but there are many similarities of what we see, how Jews navigated and how they were treated by a government in the Soviet Union in the 1940s. And that story did not really end well. And thinking about how people dealt with this in the past and being aware of what can happen in the name of greater good or fighting for justice and using Jews as pawns or maybe as just a pretense for fighting for something else. This is something that doesn't hurt to be aware of. So I'll finish my remarks here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, and I will pick up from where you left off. And first of all, let me just say thank you to the Cat Center and to Stephen Weitzman for organizing this opportunity for us to speak over Zoom and, in a sense, debrief over what I thought was a very, very productive gathering in January and early January co-sponsored by the Catt Center at Penn and the Wallenberg Institute at the University of Michigan, and the Tenenbaum Center at the University of Toronto, and the new Global Lab to study anti-Semitism, and the NYU Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And this was a very productive gathering, a workshop in January that brought together leaders in the field of anti-Semitism studies, also acknowledging the great work that has taken place through existing centers in various places that have existed for a number of years, but also taking stock of this moment that we are in post-October 7th in particular, where we've seen investment of resources, I think much to the credit of our universities and to our university administrations in many cases, a realization that we need to invest even more in creating new centers for the study of anti-Semitism, to think about both where the field has been, how we can take stock at this moment of how we might move forward, and how we might facilitate collaboration between our programs, our newly created programs, and those programs that have existed for a number of years, and as I've said, done excellent work in this field. So it was really an opportunity for us to come together and think about sort of next steps. And I just want to reflect before I talk a little bit about sort of the future of the field and new scholarship that has been created, and some of the outcomes of what I thought was a very productive gathering in January of these various centers and leading figures of the field. I just want to reflect for a moment on sort of the work that actually each of us do. Many of us come from the field of Judaic studies, and in particular modern Jewish history. And in my case, the field of Holocaust studies and modern Jewish history, and to think for a moment of how our approaches as historians, and specifically scholars of Jewish history, both might help and hinder our understanding of the present moment. Because one of the things that became clear in the conversations that we had in January was that to a certain extent there is a disconnect between the scholarship that has been done on a historical level of historical manifestations of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism in Jewish history, and the demands of the present moment to come up with effective tools to respond to what we might call contemporary anti-Semitism or contemporary manifestations of anti-Jewish hate. And one of the ways that, as Steve mentioned, we taught this class at UConn, and now we have a similar class at NYU, sort of an introduction to anti-Semitism, is to think about how our assessment, one of the first things that we do for the students is to think about how our assessment of the present moment and the situation of the present moment is influenced by the ways in which we interpret Jewish history. So many of us in our training of Jewish history might be familiar with sort of this question of, do we take an optimistic or pessimistic approach to our study of Jewish history? Do we see Jewish history as a history of suffering and persecution, or do we focus in the ideas of Salah Baron on the long periods of successful flourishing in between periods of suffering and persecution? And I think this is fruitful for us to think about, because we should think about how this approach affects our perception of the present moment. The field of anti-Semitism studies has been divided by debates over definitions of anti-Semitism, over questions of when anti-Zionism or anti-Israel hate or sentiment crosses the line into anti-Semitism. But I want us to think about sort of how our approaches as historians affect these debates. Our training as historians leads us to ask very specific questions, even about how effective such definitions of anti-Semitism might be as an analytical framework for the studying of Jewish history. Can we see different manifestations of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish animus that appear from antiquity to the present? And do we understand those manifestations all the way throughout Jewish history as part of the same phenomena? Or do we look for the very specific context to understand sort of what motivates these events? We just came out of the holiday of Purim, and if we think about Purim, do we sort of look at this as sort of a constant reappearance of the idea of Amalek? Or does our training as historians say, no, that would be completely ahistorical to see sort of phenomena and manifestations of evil that appear from antiquity to the present, and say, no, we have to be very specific about what we're talking about. We have to look at these specific phenomena in the context of the moment in which they appear and study it in that way. This approach to Jewish history are we optimists or are we pessimists, I think also influences our assessment of which strategies might be effective in the present moment. So if we are optimistic about the ability of Jews to flourish in liberal democracies and trust the promises of enlightenment and emancipation, then our assessment of both past strategies and the present moments would lead us to form alliances with other minority groups to study anti-Semitism as a broader nexus of hate. And such a diagnosis would lead us to both study anti-Semitism as part of a broader societal problem and join together with other groups in order to solve such problems. If, however, we are pessimistic about the ability of Jews to, as a minority group, to flourish in the diaspora, and believe from a Zionist perspective that all of Jewish life in the diaspora is destined to ultimately fail, either leading to continued persecution or to the disappearance of Jews and Judaism altogether, then we would study anti-Semitism as a very particular Jewish problem and promote solutions that might lead us to give up ultimately on the possibilities of life in the diaspora and promote sort of a Zionist solution as an ultimate solution to the question of the Jewish encounter with modernity. And so I'm laying this out because I think in many respects, the field, for those of us who come from the study of Jewish history, the field has shaped these two approaches to the study of Jewish history. And our fields continue to be divided by these two approaches to the current moment. And I think if we think about sort of the place of where the field of anti-Semitism studies is at the present moment, we can see these divides in terms of our assessment, the optimistic versus the pessimistic, influencing our approaches to how to solve the questions of the present moment. Now, as Steve mentioned, we were able to organize a workshop in January, which brought together scholars and institute directors from Australia, from Israel, from South Africa, from North America, from Western Europe, where we met to participate in an intensive program with important discussions. These discussions were held at the NYU Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. We had 6 workshop sessions led by leading scholars in the field. And some of the conclusions that emerged from those discussions were, first of all, that, of course, research on anti-Semitism is urgent. If anything, we need more research, both on historical manifestations of anti-Jewish hate and the contemporary moment. That the research that has been done and that will be done in the future must be interdisciplinary. And that means that we have to bring together different fields. Both, obviously, as I've talked about, Jewish history, sociology, political science, but we have to also work together with other fields from across the university. Religion, economics, digital media, communication, sociology, psychology, computer science, Israel studies, Middle Eastern studies, you name it. And in order to have an interdisciplinary approach to the study of anti-Semitism or to manifestations of hate in the present moment, this is only the kind of work that we can do at a university. I think universities are perhaps the only sector in society where we can facilitate interdisciplinary collaborations like this and have difficult collaborations and conversations about the most complex societal problems. I don't see another place where we can do this type of research. It also became clear from our conversations that scholarship on anti-Semitism must include a plurality of political and scholarly positions, and that we have to work together as centers, as institutes, as scholars coming from different orientations to accept a broad range of what might represent those political viewpoints that I outlined at the beginning, but also work together to try to figure out which strategies can be most effective to marshal the tools needed, both to take the historical knowledge that we have, the data that we have in the present moment, and come up with solutions to the present problem. I think we also spoke quite a bit about the important role that scholarship can play in providing data and information and tools of analysis to advocacy organizations that they cannot achieve on their own. That there has to be some way to bridge that divide, which unfortunately seems to be ever growing between the work that advocacy organizations and scholarship is trying to do, which is not helped by the political use of the term anti-Semitism, And we have to figure out a way to, if we really are serious about moving this work forward, to figure out a way to collaborate and do this work in a productive manner together. The workshop, I think, signaled to us that we need to have much more active development of the field. We need to support the creation of professional research associations, annual conferences, graduate student conferences, events that bring together scholars from different disciplines into conversation with one another, and promote this research that shows the importance of university research, especially at a time right now where universities and higher educations are under attack, to demonstrate that this is the sector of society that is uniquely equipped to help come up with solutions to these problems. I will stop myself there, but I think this gives you a sense for some of the ways in which we approach this question, some of the issues that we should be aware of, and some of the, hopefully, areas of research that we can focus on going forward. And Jeff, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks. So I'll begin by saying that I actually agree with much of, really with everything that has been said so far. And really only have a few things to add to that. And that is, first of all, I'll also thank those of you who are participating in this. Thanks to those of you who have come, and thanks to the other institutions that partnered with us in the conference in January, and that have been partners in dealing with anti-Semitism over the last few months as we've established the Raoul Wallenberg Institute here at the University of Michigan. So I think I've identified really 7 different categories, different ways in which I think research on anti-Semitism has been moving recently. And yeah, anti-Semitism studies is a fairly old field. Really, as long as there's been Jewish studies, there has been anti-Semitism studies. I think of the first Russian Jewish encyclopedia that was written right around the turn of the 19th century, in which the largest entry in the entire encyclopedia was on anti-Semitism. Took up almost half of the first volume on that one entry on anti-Semitism. So I think as long as there has been Jewish studies, there's been studies of anti-Semitism, and those have changed recently. One of the ways that I think we have benefited from other scholarship is in the intersections between anti-Semitism and other types of hatred, other types of ethnic and religious hatred, and other types of racial hatred. I think in particular, the recognition in race studies, and even in critical race theory, the recognition that racism is deeply embedded in American culture and is systemic in America has helped us think about anti-Semitism in the same way. So there are a lot of scholars now who look at the ways that anti-Semitism is deeply embedded within European culture, really from its origins, and from the ways in which the Bible has been interpreted over time, the way in which church authorities have imposed restrictions and limitations on the Jewish population, and the way in which, even after emancipation, ordinary people in Europe have seen the Jews as deeply embedded within that culture. And that's the way that Christianity in particular has portrayed Jews as people who crucified Jesus, as people who have refused to recognize Jesus' role as savior, as people who are forced to be witnesses to Christianity, and as people who are obstinate, who have refused to see what they regard as the truth. And those attitudes become deeply embedded in European culture. And what that means is that various groups can use anti-Semitism for particular purposes, to fight against whatever they want to be fighting against at the moment. In this sense, anti-Semitism is not just bigotry against Jews, but anti-Semitism is also the use of bigotry against Jews to achieve other purposes. And I think a lot of people are recognizing that and trying to see the linkage between this type of thinking about how we conceive of race and how we conceive of anti-Semitism. I think we also see it in relationship to the idea of Jews as privileged, which we commonly hear here in America. And there's a recognition in the scholarship, and growing recognition, that Jewish persecution has precisely been on the grounds that Jews are privileged, or on the accusation that Jews are privileged. So we have to be very careful in the use of that language. So that's, one way I think that anti-Semitism studies has changed over time and has benefited from recent research, is that relationship between anti-Semitism and racism. Another one, similarly, is the relationship between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. The earliest medieval church restrictions against Jews and terminology that was used during the Crusades against Jews lumped together Jews and Saracens, which are another word for Arabs or Muslims. And current studies also show the close relationship between attitudes towards Jews and attitudes towards Muslims. And I think we can see those two hatreds really in conversation with each other and moving together with each other. A lot of research, social science research and historical research, has drawn those conclusions and looked at those forms of hatred together to great benefit. And I think that's another way the research is developing. Third, there's a lot of research that's looking at images of Jews and anti-Semitism in less commonly studied places. There's been a lot of research in the past on anti-Semitism in Europe, but now we're seeing good research on anti-Semitism in Indonesia, in China, in Latin America, elsewhere around the world, in places where there may be fewer Jews who are living there. And in that way, we can see anti-Semitism, again, not only as bigotry against Jews, but as tools to bring about other ideas. To give an example of what I mean by anti-Semitism as tools, or anti-Semitism as instrumentalized hatred, I think of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as really the classic example of that. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion are a way that the old elites in Russia criticized democracy, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, all these ideas, the free market, all of these ideas that on the surface seem good. And a way that the old elites could discredit these ideas was by saying to the common folks, oh no, these aren't actually good ideas, they're just ploys of the Jews. And because of this latent anti-Semitism, because of the way that images of Jews are so deeply embedded in European culture, when they hear that they're tools of the Jews, people turn against those ideas. So there's been good research showing how anti-Semitism isn't only about the Jews, but is a way of explaining complex phenomena, is really at its root a conspiracy theory. And that conspiracy theory becomes more prevalent in times of difficulty, in times of state breakdown, like we're seeing right now in the United States. Anti-Semitism flourishes as people look for ways of explaining the phenomenon that's going on around them. We're seeing a lot of research on that. Then just to go through the others, there's a lot of new research on data and surveys, a lot of surveys of people, surveys of attitudes towards Jews, and surveys of experiences of anti-Semitism. Different organizations are tracking these very closely. A lot of people doing it on students on campus, including us here at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. We're launching a big longitudinal survey in collaboration with the Institute for Social Research here at the University of Michigan about how student attitudes towards anti-Semitism, as well as other forms of ethnic and religious hatred, change over time among students. And there's a lot of other organizations that are trying to do similar type of surveys. In addition to the surveys, there's ethnographic work being done on the ground to try to look into the attitudes behind those surveys. Why are people saying that they blame Jews for things that Israel is doing, for instance? And that we can determine through close study and interviews and focus groups. So a lot of that is going on. Then there's a lot of research on hate speech in the media, particularly social media, which is the ways that a lot of hate speech spreads these days, and the way that anti-Semitism spreads in social media. We all know, of course, that we have seen huge spikes in the spread of anti-Semitic hate speech on social media since October 7th. But there are studies that have more precisely tracked the spread of anti-Semitic speech as political events happen and people on social media respond to them. So I think that's also another avenue for research. Then I think the final one that I'll talk about is the relationship between anti-Semitism and violence. And that's one that I myself have done some research on in connection with the pogroms in Ukraine between 1918 and 1921. But remains a big fear of what's going to happen, of how anti-Semitism attitudes, anti-Semitic attitudes and speech may one day become violent, and when that happens and how we can explain violence on the basis of anti-Semitism. So I think those are some of the ways in which modern research and new contemporary research is helping fill in some of the gaps in anti-Semitism studies over time. And I hope that the collaboration that our institutes are doing is going to help further that type of research and introduce other forms of research as well. And I'll end my remarks on that.
So thank you all. Maybe I'll ask all three panelists to come online as we open up the conversation to questions that people in the audience may have. So probably many of you are familiar with the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, so you can use that to submit a question. And we're gonna kind of read from some of them and see what our panelists say. But let me begin with a question that I think is on a lot of people's minds, which is this this perception of the university itself as part of the problem, the source of the problem. That the university is, if not an engine of anti-Semitism, allowing anti-Semitism to take root in younger generations and to spread to the rest of the culture. And as a result of that perception, the federal government of the United States today has felt it necessary to intervene in universities and to take, I guess, what I would call a punitive approach to universities to kind of force them to confront their role in anti-Semitism. So I want to ask you all, how do you think about that perception of the university as the source of the problem rather than a solution? And do you find the measures that the federal government and others are taking, do you find that helpful to your own efforts as people on the ground helping your universities find a way forward to this, find a way forward in this circumstance? So let me just see if anybody wants to volunteer to go first on that, and otherwise I'll call on somebody. Jeff, thank you.
So although I've just been speaking, but still, so I think, since 2001, the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education has been looking at what were sometimes called forms of religious hatred and religious persecution on campuses as falling under the Title VI segment of the 1963 Civil Rights Accord. And that states that it's illegal for institutions that receive federal funding to discriminate on the basis of race, national origins, or color, or to create a hostile environment on those bases. But more recently, they have seen ethnic heritage and ancestry as falling within that Title VI. So that's a means that universities in the last, maybe more in the last 10 years or so, have started to look at ways of protecting Jewish students and Muslim students on campus who are being discriminated in the United States on those bases. The issue right now, of course, is that last week, the federal government opened up investigations, punitive investigations of 60 institutions, including my own institution here at the University of Michigan. And then the next day cut the staff of the Department of Education in half. So we don't know how those investigations are going to come out. Here, for example, we've been talking about rolling out anti-bias trainings that would teach faculty and students how to prevent discrimination on the basis of Title VI. We now don't know how the federal government is going to be interpreting Title VI. So this has become deeply problematic, simply the lack of knowledge, the lack of communication from the Department of Education on understanding what universities are obligated to do and how we can best protect students. At the same time, I think that new regulations are being used as a weapon to try to close down parts of the university, to create greater government oversight of parts of the university. And I think we have to be careful of that too. I can let others comment.
I'll jump in and just add, to the many excellent points that you made just now, Jeff. One of the challenges of the moment, and sort of as we were talking about before, is that I think it's important to be very specific to define what we're talking about. And one of the things that becomes a challenge when we start to look at different disciplines is that sometimes we're having different conversations about, first of all, how we define anti-Semitism, what sort of behaviors cross the line. One of the things that's most interesting is to have conversations with our colleagues who are in the law, for example, where, as you've just alluded to, Jeff, there are very specific definitions, very specific metrics that can be applied to a question of when something crosses the line into forms of discrimination or violations of legal definitions of discrimination or harassment or persecution, or of course violence that crosses the line in terms of civil rights law, etc. And the truth is that the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education was actually sort of issuing guidance that I found to be quite helpful in terms of thinking about the present moment of how we define sort of what types of behavior cross the line into forms of discrimination. And as Jeff has just alluded to, it's not helpful to answer your question, Steve, when basically sort of all of that is thrown out, and tools that might have been effective to help universities navigate this moment of how do we define what is something that crosses the line, right, are sort of pulled away and retracted sort of in a blanket way, right? So that is just bewildering in the present moment and makes it very difficult to navigate. And then the other thing that I'll say, which again is a plea to sort of be specific. So I talked about sort of as historians, the challenges that we have in terms of using this category of anti-Semitism as an analytical tool to try to understand different forms of behavior that are specific to different historical contexts, and it's difficult to draw the connections. But in this moment, as we've alluded to, we're seeing sort of the political use of the term anti-Semitism, which might be only intended to refer to one specific type of behavior that would be sort of forms of anti-Israel hate that cross the line into discrimination against Jewish students on campuses, or holding all Jews collectively responsible, or even sort of advocating support for terrorist organizations, right? Those are clear sort of manifestations of when anti-Israel hate crosses that line. But I think the challenge is that in the present moment, we're only seeing it being applied, and I can even see in the Q&A, being applied to sort of one side of the political spectrum, while there seems to be sort of ignoring of forms of either white nationalist hate or neo-Nazi hate, or the spread of types of conspiracy theories that have motivated some of the worst forms of political violence against Jews that we've seen in this country, even in the last 10 years, right? That's not what we're talking about. So it's again, that's where we have to be very clear in terms of sort of how we're using the term, what we're talking about, and sort of being specific in that regard.
I guess I will just add one little thing to that. I agree with Jeff and Avi with approaches and this, importance of definitions, but I am struck by that question, Steve, that you ask: are universities making it worse? And I was thinking about the disconnect we have between what us, Jewish studies or just Jewish academics working on campus, consider as anti-Semitism versus what the community, larger Jewish community outside of university, considers anti-Semitism. And there's always been disconnect between, a little bit disconnect between that and that, but now it's growing very, very fast. And there are grassroots groups, Jewish groups, that take upon themselves to examine curricula that is offered to our students and do something about this. So with the goal of protecting students from this. And that is, I think, new. That is like, to the extent that there are all these people in English-speaking world checking the syllabi and saying, "Oh, what are we teaching the students? Are they taught to hate Israel? Are they taught to to discriminate? Are they taught to hate Jews or self-hate and all that stuff?" So I think we are losing that war a little bit, because the message that we deliver from our universities about teaching critical thinking, research, all this is like, well, if you're doing that so well, why do we have all this hostility to Jews and universities as being as seen as hotbeds of anti-Semitism, maybe? And I don't have an answer to that. I don't know if universities are making it worse. But I do know one thing, that if Jews start avoiding universities because these are the places where they're not comfortable, or start choosing universities that are focused mostly on Jewish students, or smaller universities with no Jewish students, and then there's no much hostility, then we're looking at a very bleak Jewish future. And even if universities are the place of this debate is happening now, and it could be uncomfortable, I worry that all attempts to fight it in ways that don't come from within universities will result in much bigger problems. Sorry, I'll try to be a little bit more optimistic in other answers.
Thank you. So we only have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to ask our Director of Public Programs, Dr. Anna Albert, to help us call through the questions very quickly and maybe pull out a few and do this in a kind of rapid fire way, as it were.
Okay, amazing. We have a ton of questions. And so we're not going to get to most of them, I'm sorry to say, but I want to start with, there's a set of questions that I think directly relate to what you all were just talking about, that are a little bit challenging, a little bit saying, people who are out there experiencing anti-Semitism, it seems like what is coming out of Centers for Research may be minimizing or calling it slippery, or somehow fundamentally unable to embrace the wide, or unwilling to embrace a widespread perception of bad experiences. So I want to, Anna, you got to that a little bit in your comments, and I think Avi too, but I wonder if any of you want to sort of take that head on and think about what anti-Semitism research is maybe offering to complement popular perceptions, or how the two things can work together. Like, how can you communicate with people who feel that what they're getting from research centers is not adequate to their experience?
I'm happy to start, and
Sure, Avi, go ahead.
allow my colleagues to jump in. So just a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think one of the things is sort of as I've suggested in the beginning, when we have expertise in historical phenomenon, right? I think it's important for there to be a certain degree of humility in terms of sort of that we might be experts in terms of manifestations of anti-Jewish hate that have taken place historically, but we need to also study the contemporary moment and then think about what are the tools that we as historians can apply to our understanding of the past to help us better understand the current moment, which is sort of this idea of this interdisciplinary work where we have, as Jeff was talking about, these really fascinating studies that are being done about collecting data about contemporary manifestations of anti-Jewish hate that we can see through surveys or that are taking place in social media or online, or the proliferation of hate speech using new technology. And then think about, if we can bring together those scholars who are collecting the contemporary manifestations, bring them together in conversations with scholars who understand sort of, well, how has this taken place historically, and what have or have not been effective strategies to confront and respond to this? I think those can be really fruitful and productive conversations, right? So I might be able to observe all sorts of things that are taking place in the current moment. I can't necessarily understand the why, but I might be able to sort of say, okay, well, these are the strategies and approaches that Jews employed in the past, right? Either forming alliances with other minority groups, or strengthening the tools of liberal democracy, or sort of talk about sort of the Zionism as a solution to this, or advocating for the creation of a Jewish national state. Like, all of those are sort of in the toolbox of possible responses. But I think that conversation that can take place in an interdisciplinary sense, it can be a really important and effective way that we can hopefully, because yes, we see so much going on, there's so much data that's being collected, Now we need to do the analysis and have important conversations about sort of what do we do? What are the strategies and tools that can be effective in terms of policy, in terms of the law, in terms of forming alliances, all those different things that hopefully can get us out of this mess.
Maybe I'll just add that, I see anti-Semitism as symptomatic of larger conflicts that are going on in universities right now, and of a climate, really a toxic climate in many ways, is going on in universities. And the way to combat it isn't to go into the quad and yell louder than the other people. I think the way to combat it is to really focus on the roots and to cultivate values that go against anti-Semitism and that are really more inclusive for all people on campus. And I think that's what we're trying to do. It's hard work and it's slow work, and it may be not as rewarding as going into the quad and yelling louder than the other people. But I think ultimately it's the tool that is going to create a more comfortable environment.
And maybe just one kind of less, like more micro example. There's a lot of anxiety right now about Jews being discriminated and how. A lot of conversation from students who are applying for jobs. Should they remove all the references to to working in a Jewish camp or working in a Jewish organization? Will that hurt their chances of being accepted to law school or being accepted corporate job and all this? Well, one thing we can do is study those things. Studying hiring practices is a field. There are methods, there are ways to know, and interview and finding this research, working on it at the university will produce results that will help us to understand this is what we're dealing with, and people make decisions based on that research. So we're equipped to do that. Maybe we're not equipped to say how to fight anti-Semitism, or maybe my colleagues know, I have no idea. But, study things, that we know for sure. So I think that maybe is the future of one of the avenues of that research.
Thank you all so much. I think a follow-up would be to ask about, there are a number of questions about also institutions, maybe partner institutions, community institutions, and what's the state, so sort of two parts of it. What's the state of relations between academic centers or academic research and organizations like the ADL or Federation? Is there any sense in having a scenario where academics are researching what role the ADL or the Federation is playing in contemporary affairs? Are there active partnerships? And do you see the work that organizations like that are doing as being in the same vein as your work, or something apart? Anyone? You don't have to touch particular institutions, but
maybe I'll just weigh in real quickly,
Okay.
if that's okay.
Okay.
I think it's also maybe helpful to see how anti-Semitism is intersecting with other trends underway in culture. And one of those trends in American culture, at least, is just rising distrust of institutions in general. And it's something I find seeping into my own thinking, distrust of organizations that I'm not part of. So I think that in addition to addressing anti-Semitism, unfortunately, there are other challenges that will have to be faced at the same time. And one of them is the profound distrust that people have of institutions like the university, like journalism, of civil rights advocacy groups. This is something that has really seeped into culture in general. And we're not going to solve anti-Semitism if we don't have institutions able to work with each other. And so I think that has to be on the agenda in the future as well.
And I'll just jump in. I think you're exactly right, Steve. And I think one of the things, sort of, both if we think about sort of the spectrum of different types of organizations that are out there, or different institutions. So on your question asked both about sort of advocacy organizations, but I'm also thinking about, and this is, conversations that we've had, sort of more public facing institutions, museums. So I used to work at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, for example, or our neighbor down the street at NYU, the Center for Jewish History, which are institutions that are very, very important institutions that can sort of be more public facing, allow us as scholars to sort of translate and disseminate the information, which can sometimes, right, very few people read the articles that we write, very few people read the books that we write, unfortunately, but at least, working together with these public institutions, we can try to translate the significance of the work that we're doing. And then with the advocacy organizations, I mean, I think, right, there's a tension there, because on the one hand, some organizations have sort of made it a talking point or a strategy to attack universities, right? Or to say that universities are at the heart of the problem in terms of spread of certain types of anti-Jewish hate in this moment, usually focused on sort of anti-Zionism, anti-Israel sentiment. And I think for those of us who are, I think we are aware that we have to be able to separate out certain scholars, certain departments. And for those of us who are in field where hopefully we'd like to be helpful in this work, that trying to seek out sort of possible fruitful collaborations. So, you mentioned the ADL, for example. The ADL does have a Center for Anti-Semitism Research. I think that they're trying to establish partnerships with scholars at institutions, right? So there's work that can be done. There are collaborations that can be done. There's research that can be done that is based in serious, scholarly academic research that can help us to understand. But I think we can't just sort of be attacking one another. We have to be having fruitful and productive conversations and thinking about how we can move this work forward.
Thank you.
I see we're already at time. So one lesson I'm taking from this is that we collectively, the 4 institutions that we're part of, maybe we can create other opportunities to kind of engage and communicate with the public as this research develops. But for now, we're out of time. So I just want to take a moment to thank our wonderful guests for just sharing a little bit of a glimpse of how they see things, and just to underscore that this is part of an ongoing effort, and we're all kind of in this together, in a sense that as long as anti-Semitism exists in the world, there are going to be other forms of prejudice in the world, and we're going to be moving in the wrong direction. So thank you all very much, and have a good afternoon.